10 years ago, there wasn't a single country other than South Africa in sub-Saharan Africa that had an international credit rating. Today, there are 20 countries that have that. And part of that is to do with the benefits of debt relief and the clean balance sheets that they have now. A major part of it is to do with these economies have been expanding for the past 15, 20 years. Now, Ghana will be the first, and it will be followed by Nigeria, Zambia, Kenya. They all want to take advantage of the promises of debt relief, which just haven't been realised, and they're all being criticised for it. So we're in a situation at the moment where these countries have expanded economies, they've got aspirations to develop, and they're seeking funds wherever they can to do that. And the people who are saying we should put Africa on the agenda are putting Africa on the agenda to say, how do we stop them doing this? And I think that's the issue that we should really be concerned with now, not saying let's make sure that the G8 are held to their promises. We should be saying let's make sure the G8 and, in fact, the NGOs should step out of the way. You know, the Ghanaian government knows what it's doing.
I think there's something really, really positive happening in Africa, which you don't hear about very often, which is quite strong economic growth, but also a danger that that could be derailed precisely by the whole growth with responsibility process that the leaders at the G8 summits are pushing, and which the protesters are trying to hold them to account over. I mean, it is astonishing in a way that the fact Africa is doing well isn't well known in the West. That means that Africans have more choices, they have access to more resources, they can have a better lifestyle, they can have more consumer goods. So that's really positive. And it's having all sorts of more specific benefits you could point to if you had more time. So, for example, I just read the other day that last week Access Kenya, which is a Kenyan internet service provider, was floated on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. So you're even getting internet companies being launched in Africa, run by Africans. All really genuinely positive and not being talked about. Now, of course, you have to be a bit guarded when you make claims in relation to this, because although Africa has grown very fast in recent years, it's starting from a very low base. So in order to get to a standard of living that we have in the West, that kind of growth would need to continue for a long time, and it ideally would be even faster than it's been. But one thing that I think is a real danger to it is the growth with responsibility process. I mean, why say growth with responsibility? Why not just say growth, let's have more growth? That would be the common sense thing, that more growth, Africa benefits. So let's just say go for growth. Why add that caveat to with responsibility? And I think the with responsibility bit is a really nasty Orwellian kind of term. Because what it really means is, well, you can have a little bit of growth, a tiny bit of growth, but you have to accept all sorts of conditions, very heavy conditions, in order for us to regard you as being worthy of that growth. That's what's really being said. And what that means is, in practice, is that a deal is being proposed and, in fact, enacted by the G8, and this is something that the NGOs like Oxfam and Action Aid are supporting, where essentially what's being said is, we'll give you a bit of aid. We know you desperately need aid, you're dirt poor, so we'll give you some aid. But in return for that, you have to pay a very heavy price. And what that price is, first of all, to accept interference in your internal affairs, what you can do, how you can behave and so on. And even more important than that essentially what's being said is that African countries have to give up their dreams. And that might seem like a bit of a wishy-washy kind of thing to say, but in fact I think it's extremely important. It's absolutely crucial. Because what's really being said is that African countries can't have the aspiration to be modern. They can't have the aspiration to be developed. They can't have the aspiration to be predominantly urbanized societies. What they have to do is to accept the Millennium Development Goals, which are really about just alleviating the worst aspects of poverty, as was discussed in the film. What they have to limit their aspirations to is just, we want to just get rid of the worst aspects of the most terrible poverty, but other than that, leave these African societies intact. That's what's really being said. And that's a very high price to pay for more aid because of the conditions attached to it. So what I would say is, let's ditch the growth with responsibility thing. It's entirely negative. Certainly, Africa could do with resources from the outside, but those resources shouldn't be tied to the kind of conditions that have been talked about. Let's have real growth.
I wanted to ask you what you thought about the role of the G8. Do you think it's solely paternalistic, or is it something that the African nations could use to their advantage, or should it be completely abolished? And if it was, what could replace it?
As far as I can see, the main role of the G8 nowadays is posturing. It's really different politicians using it to play to their domestic audiences. So the British media will say, look, Tony Blair, he's a great leader in the world and he's showing the world about Africa and climate change and he's playing a key role. And I'm sure the German media is saying a similar thing about Angela Merkel. Or in America they're saying George Bush is leading the world. And in that sense, I don't see it plays any positive role at all. I think it's entirely negative because the people who suffer as a result of that posturing are the people in Africa and the people in third world countries. They suffer most. So I don't see a positive role for the G7 or G8.
I wanted to ask, it might be a really naive question to ask, right? But if somebody's asking for aid or a loan, if anybody does, they expect to have strings put on that. It's like even if we go to a bank and get a loan, you know, it's not necessarily, you know, there are restrictions. And I think you need to be able to explain to people why Africa should ask for this aid and not expect there to be some conditions.
Obviously, on a certain level, you know, if you're going to have, if you're going to give money to somebody as equals, or if it's going to be a kind of contractual relationship, then there's going to be certain conditions set by that. So if I borrow money from the bank in order to buy a house or to build a house or whatever, they say you need to repay it in this amount of years, and it needs, you know, you're going to pay this much interest, whatever, you know, that's one thing. But if the bank started telling me, like, how to raise my children in that house, or how to live in that house, or what I should do in that house, that's something else entirely. And in that way, it is very kind of concretely closing down options and choices for African people and African states.
Are there problems in the Western economies and the Western societies which is holding back Africa, rather than something about Africa itself?
A partial answer, I would say, is that you have an incredible amount of cynicism in the West about, you know, politicians, and they're all crap and they're terrible and they're corrupt and everything. And then people read their experience and their take on the West, and they're seeing, well, that must also be the case in Africa, and that must explain why Africa is so poor. So I think there is a clear relationship between problems in the West and the way things are perceived in the West and the way Africa is perceived and other third world regions are perceived. And that's something very important to look at in more detail, I think, as well.